Hello everyone, this is Mr. Smith, here to talk about the unit, often referred to the biochemistry unit, or the molecules of life. These molecules of life are also called biomolecules. This is a really interesting unit. It's a very short unit, and it's really cool because all organisms are made up of these only four biomolecules. That's really cool. But even though we have four biomolecules, there's a lot of variety within each subcategory. Another interesting thing about this particular unit is for those of you who've had some physical science or chemistry, you will see some review in the elements that we'll discuss, and also maybe some structures that we will look at. So hopefully that will be of help. And for those of you who've not had physical science or chemistry, it will be a really good intro into those classes when you have them in the near future. So don't be worried. If you have any questions, like always, feel free to email me or send me a note in class. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to call me either, so I can be reached in multiple ways for those of you who may not want to ask in class. But always remember, if you have that question in class, more than likely others do too. So here we go in introducing the biomolecules of life. At the end of this unit, you should be able to answer these objectives, or be able to explain, identify, or list these terms. So here is one: organic. What does that term mean, and how does it relate to those biomolecules in organisms? Be able to list the four biomolecules of life and the categories of each. Be able to explain what does a building block mean, or recognize that term. Also be able to identify and label the monomers of each biomolecule. Identify and list the subunits for each biomolecule's monomer. And list or explain the role or that purpose for what that biomolecule does and how it relates to the cellular level and to the entire organism. How is it of benefit? Also list the location of the biomolecule within the organism, and list some common sources of those molecules. So, like always, if I'm moving at too fast of a pace for you, regardless if you are working from home in extra guided information that you need to add to what we've talked about in class, or you're working from home and you're not able to join us, feel free to stop and pause this audio as often as you need to. Also, as a reminder, if you are working in class or at home and you're using this as an additional resource to what we've talked about in class, please keep your notes open to what we've discussed in class and add to those notes. If you do not have some of this information that will be discussed in the slides, you need to add that information to your notes and your notebook. So, all organisms consist of these four biomolecules, and those biomolecules contain at least the three basic elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. You will hear me and other teachers refer to this as CHO. It's just a short acronym that we will use. There'll be a couple other acronyms that we will use in this unit, and that will help you to remember. What is CHO? It's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And these molecules that consist of all organisms. And you've heard the term organic. What does that mean, though, in terms of an organism, whether it be a plant or an animal? It just means that it can be broken down or decomposed. We know that all organisms eventually decompose, but what does that mean? It's broken down into those basic elements that make up all of those molecules. Carbon, it breaks down also into hydrogen and oxygen. There's some other molecules that have other elements, but they're broken down into those basic elements, and that means that it's organic. Organelles in the cell, they make and or use these molecules to carry out functions. For example, you will hear me refer to, and in the text it will also be used, which organelle is responsible for making protein, which is one of the biomolecules. That would be ribosomes. So these organelles make these biomolecules, or they will use them. We all probably have heard of the cliche, you are what you eat, in health class or in reading or on the news. That term is very true, and it's also taken to the next level in biology in referring to other organisms, not just animals, including humans, but for example, fungi. They do not actually eat in the terms of a mouth or intestines and stomach, but they decompose the dying and the decaying matter around them, and they consume that as their energy source. So they're consuming the carbon and the hydrogen, the oxygen, and the other elements to get food. Bacteria also consume the byproducts, as well as protists. They consume byproducts that contain the carbon and the hydrogen and oxygen to obtain their energy sources. So all organisms do this. All organisms consist of these biomolecules, and it's very vital in order for them to survive. So what are those 4 biomolecules? They're carbohydrates, they're lipids, they're proteins, and they're nucleic acids. Those are the 4 that you need to know. Particularly carbohydrates, they're known as saccharides. The 3 subcategories that we'll talk about: monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. We'll also discuss lipids. They're known as fats, the oils, the sterols, and the steroids. You've probably heard the term saturated fats and unsaturated fats. We will discuss what are those differences amongst those biomolecules in terms of a chemical standpoint. From structure, what do they look like, and be able to determine the different sources of each. Proteins. We all know how important proteins are to us, and it's possible some food sources, but there are lots of subcategories of proteins. We will focus on 3: structural proteins, hormones, yes, they are proteins, and enzymes. You may have heard and recognized some of these, but we'll go into a lot more detail in future units. But being able to recognize the basics of all proteins and how they're very similar, but yet they're very diverse. Nucleic acids. This is the one molecule that's considered the information molecule. It's like DNA and RNA. You've heard of that, but probably have not gone into a lot of detail from a chemical standpoint and how they differ and how they're very similar. Biomolecules, they contain building blocks. They each have a different monomer or subunit, and these are the building blocks of nature. So each biomolecule consists of a small unit known as a building block. You will hear me or you will see it in assessments that say, what is the building block of a protein, or what is the monomer of a nucleic acid. That's just saying the same term. A building block is also referred to as a monomer. Many text, presentations, and so forth. The prefix mono means one. So if you've got one unit or one molecule, that is the basic building block covalently bonded to other monomers to make a particular larger structure known as a polymer. For example, one single brick cannot make a house, but many bricks together, connected together, bonded together, make the larger structure, the house. So the diagram below corresponds with the in-class activity that we did with cutting and pasting the monomer. We did the monomer saccharides. Several monosaccharides together equal a polysaccharide. So poly, the prefix poly, means many. So if you have many monomers together, you have a polymer. So consider all of these biomolecules to be polymers. Those complex carbs are a polymer. The larger proteins, or proteins in general, are the polymer. The triglycerides, for example, they are the polymer. And the DNA and the RNA, they are the polymer. So, going forward, we will list the monomers for each of the biomolecules in the next slides, along with other characteristics that you should be able to identify for each different biomolecule. The very first biomolecule, carbohydrates, they're referred to as sugars or saccharides in more technical terms. Those who go into the medical profession or just getting your blood work, you have parents or grandparents that refer to the saccharides, or you see this in terminology in your medical printouts from the doctor's office. The saccharide is just a fancy word for sugar. That building block is a monosaccharide. Sugars only contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We will refer to this in class as CHO. You can recognize carbohydrates with rings, typically 5 or 6-sided rings, as shown to the side here in this chemical structure. You do not have to identify fructose versus sucrose versus cellulose. However, you should be able to identify that as a ring. 5 and or 6-sided rings that have carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. At this level, you should recognize that is a carbohydrate. They can also be recognized in text with ending in ose. For example, cellulose, we will talk about those. Sucrose, glucose, fructose, all of those that should be able to recognize that as a sugar. Another one that is referred to a lot, we will talk about this in our future unit discussing how to plants get their energy and how other organisms get their energy through glucose. Glucose is recognized in the chemical formula C6H12O6. But regardless, if you cannot recognize carbon, hydrogen, oxygen always in terms of the numbers, you can recognize a ratio. And this ratio for carbs is 1 to 2 to 1, as indicated in that chemical formula for glucose. You have, for every 6 molecules of carbon, you have 12 hydrogen molecules. And the 6 molecules of oxygen as well. So that ratio breaks down. Everything's divisible by 6. So that ratio is 1 to 2 to 1. So monosaccharides, they are the building block. Some common monosaccharides that we will discuss are glucose and fructose. Common disaccharides are fructose and lactose. You probably have seen and heard of these terms. You can look on food labels or drink labels. Gatorade is a great example. You will see this in milk sources, lactose, of course. But both of these common monosaccharides and disaccharides are subunits for polysaccharides, the bigger polymers, okay? They are often referred to as simple sugars for quick energy because they are the major fuel for cells. Quick energy for the cell in the body, they include options with fruits, milk, candy, cane sugar, and corn syrup. And like I mentioned before, Gatorades and some of the sugary drinks, they're not considered a very good long-term energy source. They are quick energy, and that helps your cells to get a boost. The common polysaccharides, you've heard of these, but just a reminder, they are starch. Starch is in our potatoes and other vegetables like carrots and corn and peas. Also glycogen. You may have not heard of that term, but glycogen is stored in the liver and muscle. And cellulose. This is a big one. Cellulose gives that rigidity and support because it's in the plant cell walls. That helps the plant organisms to withstand the wind and the rain and environmental factors like that. And these more complex carbohydrates, polysaccharides, that's what I'm talking about, they take longer to break down because they are more complex in structure. There are more rings connected together than just two. They are sometimes 3, 4, and 5, and many rings strung together, covalently bonded, and that's why they take longer to break down. So a great example of that taking longer to break down is that cellulose found in plants, and the plants that we eat, say often referred to as roughage, lettuces and broccoli and cabbage. That helps it to take longer to digest, but it gives it the rigidity and support that plant needs to withstand the environment. So lipids. Some of you may not have ever actually heard that term, but you probably have heard of fats and oils. Definitely have heard of steroids in the news and the media. And you may not have heard of sterols, but those are all collectively called lipids. And they really do not have a monomer, but they have subunits. A subunit that makes up a lipid monomer is one subunit of glycerol. Glycerol is a carboxyl group, and you can have several carboxyl groups connected together, multiple strings, but each carboxyl group usually has a fatty acid chain subunit. So, for example, one that almost all people have either heard about or will hear about from their medical doctor, their parents or their grandparents' medical doctors, their lab work comes back and they've tested for triglycerides. Triglycerides is just that fat that's in your bloodstream. It consists of a glycerol, actually 3, because to each carboxyl group is a fatty acid chain. So there's 3 fatty acid chains on a triglyceride. Tri meaning 3. So that helps you to have that visual. If you're still needing or wanting to look that up, please feel free to Google the triglyceride chemical structure and a picture. You can find many links to pictures of that chemical structure for triglyceride. Lipids, as you can see in the picture above in the top right hand corner, you see carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We refer to this as CHO once again. So one of the differences between the different kinds of lipids is that they can be bent in a chemical structure or drawn in a linear fashion. Look at the bottom left hand corner. That linear lipid or fat there is drawn straight, and it's saturated, meaning it has the full amount of hydrogens that can bond with the carbons that are there. So the maximum amount of hydrogens means that it is saturated or fully hydrogenated. But other lipids can be drawn bent. That bottom left-hand corner, the very bottom chemical structure, is bent, and you can see that there's a double bond. It can also have a triple bond, so be able to recognize either the double or the triple bonds, those covalent bonds, means that it's not fully hydrogenated. It's not saturated, so we use that term unsaturated. So it can have multiple bonds between the carbons, so instead of bonding with hydrogen, it has multiple bonds with carbon. Also, you may have heard or recognized that saturated fats, they're not the good fats. They are often referred to as unhealthy fats that dietitians will refer to, being either solid to semi-solid at room temp. Examples: animal fat, lard, wax, grease, butter. Those are ones that are not healthy. They clog your arteries and your veins and can eventually lead to arteriosclerosis and heart disease and a lot of health problems. So we've got to limit our saturated fats in our diet. Unsaturated fats, these are generally considered the healthier fats and oils, and they're usually liquid at room temp. Those of you in class saw the demonstration where I showed the vegetable oil, the olive oil, fish oil capsules are often taken or recommended to be taken by your medical doctors. Fish oil is a very good source, healthy source. Olive oil is as well, and you can drizzle that on your vegetables or your salad, and a little goes a long way because you really don't need a lot of fat, but you do need the healthier fats. The great thing about lipids too is they contain anywhere between 2 to 3 times the amount of energy as carbs. So they provide the long-term energy. You really need to remember that. Long-term energy storage for animals particularly comes from these lipids. They also help give buoyancy to animals such as ducks. And whale blubber, you've heard probably of whale blubber, or maybe you haven't, but whale blubber is that fat or that lipid that's contained within that organism. They also help to cover or insulate cells. A great example is the myelin sheathing on nerve cells. We'll talk about those specialized cells, and we've mentioned that briefly. But those cells, many cells, have to be covered to protect them, and that comes from the lipids. And also, we will go into a lot of detail about the cell membrane and how important that is. But the structural support that is in the cell membrane comes from a phospholipid bilayer. The lipid was that there's 2 lipid layers, and also within the cell membrane there's steroids, so they give some rigidity and support, and they help with the cell membrane. Our third biomolecules, proteins. The building blocks of these proteins, you've heard of this, but it's the monomer amino acids. Okay, so amino acids, they're connected together. Many of these. And they're connected with peptide bonds to form polymers. The polymer is the protein. Many of you have heard of amino acids if you're working out. Some dietitians and health trainers and things like that may talk about getting a good variety of amino acids in your diet, eating a healthy diet, but there are only 20 different amino acids in all organisms. But yet, how can we have So many different kinds of proteins and such variety between organisms, but also within our own body. Um, that comes from the shape, the size as well. The shape and the size of a protein. Um, I've kind of given you a one visual, bottom right hand corner, of this is a hemoglobin molecule. Hemoglobin is protein that helps to bind iron and carry oxygen throughout the blood. It's very important. But that is a three-dimensional shape, electron microscope pictograph of what hemoglobin looks like. It's three-dimensional. And the size of a protein as well. All those are determined by the amount of amino acids and the order, the temperature, and the pH. The job and the specificity of a protein is also very dependent upon temperature and pH. Proteins work at a specific temperature. Proteins work at a specific pH. If it's not the right conditions, temperature and or pH, that protein will not work effectively or at all. So one of our vocab words, like I've done with other vocab words in this slideshow and encourage you to do as well in your own writing, is to underline or bold them. And another one is denature. So what does that mean? To denature means to unfold or break down by changing the temperature and the pH. You can do this in a lab by increasing or decreasing the pH, or increasing or decreasing your temperature, and it makes that protein ineffective. But by unfolding and unraveling that protein in a lab, you can break it down further. And unfortunately, if you're running a temperature, you've been exposed to hypothermia, or if you're outside organism like a plant or a protist or bacteria, and you've been exposed to extreme pH conditions, your proteins are not going to work effectively. So how can you recognize a protein? A protein consists of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. We refer to this as the acronym CHON. And the side picture here has a diagram. You can recognize this alpha carbon connected to a hydrogen, as well as a carboxyl group. The amino group, amino meaning it has nitrogen. And of course that variable group, R, or a side chain sometimes drawn, that makes each amino acid different. That side chain is what makes valine different from leucine and glutamine and glycine. So just if you can recognize that it contains nitrogen with a functional group connected to a carboxyl group, then you have yourself the basic building block amino acid. String them together, you have a protein. Those three subcategories: structural, hormonal, or enzymatic. Structural proteins help to provide support, movement, transport, and they help transport other molecules as well as proteins within the cell and also to other cells. Some examples are silk fibers, collagen and keratin, actin and myosin, and also the proteins that are in cilia. We're talking about cilia and flagella that may be on a sperm cell, or cilia in your nose hair, or the cilia or flagella that are on bacteria and some protists. And we also talked about hemoglobin, how important that is to prevent anemia, because it binds with the iron and carries the oxygen to all of your cells. We will talk about this in a future genetics unit, particularly with sickle cell anemia. And also, we do have proteins in plants. The plant seeds also have an interesting way of, they have protein in the seeds that help store the proteins for future, that's needed for the future, for that seed to germinate in those and make it in the right conditions. Hormones, what are they? They help to coordinate and regulate body functions. And regardless if it's a plant, there's pheromones and there's plant hormones. There's also all kinds of animal hormones. There's many different kinds. I've only listed a few. We've probably all heard of diabetics having to take their insulin. But also insulin's made naturally if you are non-diabetic, and your insulin naturally helps control your blood sugar. We also have many hormones that help control our blood pressure, kidney functions. Two of them are aldosterone and angiotensin 2. And we have lots of different kinds that deal with our reproductive organs. Estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone are just a few. And the last subcategory of proteins are enzymes. Enzymes are very vital, particularly to the more complex organisms like plants and animals. But they're important to all organisms. But without these enzymes, we would not be able to have some of the more complex chemical reactions, because these enzymes help to accelerate the chemical reactions by lowering the activation energy. For example, we wouldn't be able to get the nutritional value out of our food if it weren't for these digestive enzymes in our stomach and our intestines. And one in particular situation, genetic disease that we'll talk about in one of our genetics units, is cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis patients, they lack a particular enzyme that helps to break down the mucus. So if you're lacking that enzyme, you're not able to carry out that reaction and break down that mucus. So that builds up as a result, and it builds up in the lungs and intestines and causes complications. We'll go into a lot more detail from a genetic standpoint, a DNA standpoint, but you'll hear me and the text refer to cystic fibrosis as an example of enzyme deficiency. Sources. Hopefully you're eating very well, but some healthy sources of protein are chicken, lean meat such as lean beef, pork, seafoods, non-fried particularly, are a lot healthier to reduce the amount of lipids and the fats that are the unhealthy fats. Nuts, beans, milk, cheese, and low-fat yogurt are also healthy choices of protein. That very last biomolecule, probably considered the most important one, makes you who you are. It is nucleic acids, also referred to as the genetic information molecule or the genetic information storage molecule. The monomer for a nucleic acid sounds very similar. So we can refer in word association, nucleic acid is made up of nucleotides. So the monomer of a nucleic acid is a nucleotide. What is a nucleotide? It is a phosphate connected to a 5-sided sugar, then connected to a nitrogen base. So if you look at the diagram here of a DNA nucleotide, you can recognize the sugar ring having carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And of course, if it's a nitrogen base, it's going to contain nitrogen, and the phosphate group contains phosphorus. So we refer to this in class with the acronym as CHOMP. When you see those 5 elements, the only biomolecule to have 5 elements, C, H, O, N, and P, that is CHOMP. That is a nucleic acid. And it can be of one of 2 types that we will talk about in class. It can be either DNA or RNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. That is very complex, and yes, DNA is very complex. The D stands for deoxyribose. That is the sugar that is contained within that nucleotide. But I also tell students that the D can stand for double helix. If you're trying to remember in word association, DNA, if you imagine a ladder, look at the top right hand side of the screen. Take a ladder, envision that, and then twist it. But we also need to know with DNA that the sides of the ladder are your phosphate connected to your sugar, deoxyribose in this case. That makes up the sides of the ladder. So what makes up the rungs of the ladder? That would be those nitrogen bases. And the nitrogen bases in DNA can be of one of four types. And your DNA has all four of these in different order and different combinations. They would be thymine, adenine, guanine, and cytosine. We will go into a lot greater detail about DNA in our molecular genetics unit, but just as a reminder, you will need to know that this information, the DNA, it is stored in the nucleus. The sequence of the amino acids for your proteins, that sequence, that code is contained within your DNA. And it is very important for a process we'll go into with protein synthesis in the near future. But that next step to getting that code transcribed is transcribed to a messenger, that messenger RNA, another nucleic acid. So RNA itself is very similar. The sugar, however, is ribose. So our word association you can understand or relate to is ribonucleic acid. And there's some differences between RNA and DNA. One of that being is that RNA is a single helix. And it has three different forms. Those three forms assist with protein synthesis. DNA can't leave the nucleus. However, RNA can, and it does, and that's very vital to the protein synthesis. But you should, at this point in time, definitely recognize that the sugar for RNA is ribose, so there's a difference between RNA and DNA. And there's also another difference, the nitrogen bases. It too contains 4 nitrogen bases. The difference here is that RNA does not contain thymine. It contains uracil instead. It also contains adenine, guanine, and cytosine, much like the DNA molecule. And we said before, there's 3 forms that assist with protein synthesis. There's 3 forms of RNA. They are messenger RNA, written with mRNA. Transfer RNA is written as tRNA, and ribosomal RNA is often written as rRNA. Just for future reference, and we will need to know in the future, that messenger RNA, it's vital. It actually gets the code from DNA by being transcribed. That message or that code is transcribed to the messenger RNA. And transfer RNA. That transfer RNA gets the code and it's translated, and it helps to bring that correct amino acid to the ribosome. We'll go into the much greater detail in the future, but transfer RNA, translate, that's a helpful word association there. And rRNA. The R stands for ribosomal. So no big surprise that ribosomes consist of approximately 50% rRNA. One thing to note is that nucleic acids cannot be consumed, or the genetic information can't be consumed to be of benefit to the organism by eating or drinking a food source. So we will go into detail on how it is that we get that genetic information and how we differ from other organisms, as well as how we differ from similar, I should say, to organisms, and that would be through our DNA. In future units, we will discuss how that genetic information, DNA as well as RNA, is exchanged. How do we create genetic variability? So your activity today is based upon this presentation. You need to complete the table below in your notebook. It will be part of the notebook check that I do at the end of the unit. You need to do this on a separate sheet of paper. It needs to be quite large. It needs to take up pretty much the entire sheet of notebook paper. And as always, please do this in pencil. I highly recommend you do this in pencil because I also want you to try and remember as much as you can on your own in completing this table before you refer back to the slides above. If you are working in class to complete this, because you've already completed the in-class assignment, this should be a real quick review as we've discussed all of this in class with our in-class assignment. Do not hesitate, regardless if you're working in class or you're working from home, as a tutorial to Google and to research some other examples. I highly encourage you to get other food examples that's not only what we discussed in class and in the slides above, but I really would like you to research out some others, and if you find something interesting, please share. I also highly recommend you to research and Google the other places within the cell and the body of these organisms that these 4 biomolecules are located to get other examples. So the more examples that you can get, the better it will help you in future knowledge for our units that we will cover for the different kingdoms. So that will help you. So please do this. Remember, if you have any questions, feel free to email me or ask in class if you like. So once you've completed this table on your own, please feel free to ask me, and if you want to verify if your answers are correct. But also know that once you have completed this assignment, if you're working in class and you're working ahead of the other students, that please go to the next slide, slide 11. There's another assignment there for you, another resource that I really encourage you to look at. And that would be our video. I like to use, and you guys seem to enjoy, the Amoeba Sisters. This particular video is approximately 7.5 minutes long, so it's not very long. I do encourage you to pause it, or if you want to play it once and then go back and review it and re-see this video and pause, because the handout, I've also included a link here with the handout. If you're working in class, the handout is located at the front of the classroom. But if you're working from home and you don't already have a handout, you can transcribe that, or you can feel free to print from home. That's great. Either way, whatever works best for you. Just be sure to label that handout if you are not able to print one. If you just want to transcribe, that's great. That's fine. But this is in addition to this additional resource that I highly encourage you to look at. It's not very long and lengthy, but it's a great review and will give you more examples. So, like always, if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to email me, ask in class, call me. I can be reached. So, hope you've enjoyed, and that's our biomolecule unit. Thank you.